I think it's really worth understanding that your progress in your personal relationships, your friendships, your work, your own health comes when you do, not when you talk about doing. Meetings are almost always talking about doing, not doing. Messages are almost always talking about doing, not doing. And so when we respond slowly and carefully and we truncate both messages and meetings, what we do is we create space for doing, which makes you a more effective person, which has the knock-on effect of boosting your personal psychology to say, I am an effective person, which makes you an effective person, which gives you the ability to have the impact that you want to have on the world.
Hello and welcome to the Optimal Agency Podcast. My name is Patrick Cummings. As always, I'm joined by John Gilson. Together with you, we are exploring the ideas of agency, diving deep to discover a set of guidelines on how each of us can best operate in the day-to-day, maximize our personal autonomy, professional freedom, and ultimately our positive impact on the world. Thank you so much for tuning into the show this week. How are you, Mr. Gilson?
I'm great, Pat. Let's do this.
I'm excited to get into this chat. But first, every other week, we have a longer discussion, as we are doing today, on how we can own our lives by becoming optimal agents. Next week, we'll have a shorter episode where we will answer one of our listener questions. This week, we are going to do our last episode covering one of the 18 rules of health, wealth, and time. We've got up this week, time rule number 6, respond slowly and carefully. And then we will wrap up the episode with a recommendation to help us go even deeper into this particular time rule. All right, my friend, time rule, as I like to do with all of the episodes about our rules, I want to just couch us in the whole set of rules of time. We've got rule number 1, default to no. Number 2, limit recurring commitments. Number 3, preserve unstructured time. Number 4, volunteer with caution. Number 5, set boundaries and eliminate interruptions. And what we're going to talk about this week, respond slowly and carefully. And if you're new here, we do have episodes on every one of those rules. So go back in the archives and you will find them. All right, rule number 6, respond slowly and carefully. Why is this a rule of time? Why does this matter?
I got myself into a place, Patrick, where I wasn't doing this, and I saw the negative repercussions. Responding quickly and emotionally would be the opposite of this, right? And what that tends to yield is a game of Pong, where you are answering a message to answer it, not because you're trying to create progress, where you are answering a message because you were triggered by it, meaning the content of your response doesn't highlight you in your best form. And so I began to think about, what can I do to countermand these emotional responses, these triggerings, especially when I'm overwhelmed or when I have too much work to do, is exactly when that would tend to occur. And how do I take responsibility for the fact that I'm probably prolonging that overwhelm by not using messaging effectively? And so can I respond slowly and carefully to incoming in a way that will give me back that sense of agency and control in my communications with other people?
Love that. I failed at this the other night. It was like 9:30. I rarely look at my email on my phone, but I was kind of grumpy and I looked at my email and I'd gotten a message and I just shot off a response. And the next morning it just caused it caused 7 more messages to unscrew my one sentence, too snippy, sarcastic response. And I was like, that was just stupid. There's a reason I don't respond on my phone, because it too often ends up being that. And so I'm excited about this conversation because I just went through it. I need to be reminded of it clearly.
Brilliant. So, we kind of hinted at the why. Why do I respond slowly and carefully? One is to get the right tone so that you don't write the snippy, sarcastic thing that creates problems. The other is your message going to create progress? Is it going to get the communication closer to the end of the communication cycle? Right? Is it going to get something done? Is it going to achieve something? So are you sending the best response? The second reason to respond slowly and carefully is cadence control. If you respond quickly to something offhand and low content with something offhand and low content, guess what your next message with that person's going to be? Something with low content, quickly dashed off. You're essentially not going to achieve whatever your aims are, whether it's personally, whether it's in a corporation, etc. So by responding slowly and carefully and asking yourself that really simple question, is this communication creating progress? You get yourself out of that game of Pong of you talk, I talk. And so we can move from why should you respond slowly and carefully, because it's largely self-evident, to, well, how do you do it? How do you do it? Most asynchronous communication software, and when I mean asynchronous, I mean you are not in a live dialogue with somebody via phone or in person or on a video chat, comes with beeps and pings. You get on your phone and there's that little red dot that says you have email, and you get into the operant conditioning of going, oh boy, who knows what this is? Let me check it out. And you check it out. And of course, the implicit expectation of having checked it out is you are also expected to respond to it. Well, let's just look back at what kicked off that chain. It was that little red dot. Okay, get rid of the dot. That's the first step. Get rid of the dot, right? And if you look at that with messaging software, whether Slack, Instant Messenger, Signal, WhatsApp, etc., it's the same thing. In fact, I would enjoy it if anyone with a computer eliminated any and all desktop notifications that something from a communication channel has arrived. It doesn't matter. And it's distracting you. And so if you got onto and I have a Mac, but if you got onto my laptop, it never pings me about anything. And that's within my control, because I understand I'm helpless if I look. I'm helpless if I look, see a message, feel the need to respond, and respond. Okay, so we've got the environmental control of eliminating beeps, pings, desktop notifications. The next thing we need to do is batch responding. Not a word. So what I want to do is say, I'm going to leave time between any message that comes in and my response to it naturally by having on my calendar times at which I will respond to incoming messages. And this is a very old idea, but it's also a very effective one. I will respond to email, right, as the last thing that I do before shutting down for the day. I'll put an hour in there, or 40 minutes, or frankly, given the amount of email control I've got at this point, 15 minutes to respond to any messages that have come in during the day. What that enables me to do is to say, I am in the mode right now of slow, careful response. In fact, you could call that block on your calendar slow, careful response, so that you remind yourself of what you're to do when you do that. By leaving that gap, you're going to give yourself some ability to process what's there. Here's the next thing I'd say. If you, in that time block, come across a message that you find especially triggering, it makes you angry, it makes you sad, it makes you want to say, I hope you die a fiery death, surrounded by everyone and everything you love. Like if that's your natural response to an incoming, don't respond. Yeah. Just save that for the next block when you've had time to think about what is a productive response to this, what is a non-emotional response. The third thing, and this is an art, but one I believe we're all capable of. You need to recognize the non-urgent attempting to disguise itself as the urgent. And this should be from your perspective, not someone else's. And so the only things that should be urgent from your perspective are the things that move you forward towards your own priorities and goals as a professional. Of course, those goals should take the good of the collective into account, but we'll often get a message, a ping, I'm going to say a Slack because it's become a verb, or an email where somebody needs something right away. Is getting them that thing right away and hijacking your priorities worth the response? That's the question. And the answer could be yes. The answer could be yes. This person signs my paychecks, therefore, yes. right? This person does not sign my paychecks, and this has nothing to do with my priorities, therefore, no, right? And so if you can recognize the non-urgent, it gives you permission to put it in that next time block for a response. It gives you permission to not instantly knee-jerk. Okay? And then there's the big question we've been asking over and over and over again with this. Ask yourself, am I creating progress or am I playing catch? Mm-hmm. Clearing your inbox is not a work goal. You will not receive any rewards from your organization. You will not get more customers. You will not sell more things. You will not get a pay raise because you cleared your inbox. You will get all of those things because you took action towards a business goal. And so get it out of your mind that you need to clear that thing and start saying, with everything in here that I have deemed as important, I'm going to respond in a way that gets us closer to the finish line.
Love that. We're going to get into some tactics, more specific tactics, but I think I've got one follow-up question, which is just around that idea of recognizing the non-urgent. And I think about it because you basically said it, which is, I think sometimes when we don't know, when we aren't really clear on our priorities, we end up inserting making somebody else happy as our priority. And a lot of times it's, to your point, the person who signs the check. And so the only priority we really have is make sure that individual is not upset at us. And that's where we can get into trouble, because we end up running in circles and oftentimes running away from the thing that intellectually, and if we were to step away, say that thing is the task that is the most important. And everything that I'm being asked to do, this individual is asking me to do, this individual is pulling me away. I'm only saying yes because I'm scared.
Let's talk about what happens, Patrick, when you don't allow yourself to be scared and you do not acquiesce to someone just because they sign your check. Okay? Have you ever heard the acronym HIPPO, highest paid person, the opinion of the highest paid person?
No.
Highest paid person's opinion, HIPPO.
HIPPO,
okay?
Got it.
It's
okay.
when you go to a meeting and whoever's right is whoever makes the most money.
Right.
Right. So whoever's right is whoever's highest in the hierarchy.
Yep.
It's not the case, obviously. Who's right is who's correct, not, regardless of their seniority level. And an interesting thing has happened to me in my own career when I have and I've typically reported into the top of that stack every time I've actually had a job. When I wasn't the C something, I was reporting to the C something. And when you push back, when you say no, what you get, provided it's delivered appropriately, is respect. I had a CEO of a very large company tell me that he wanted to do something that very obviously would destroy scads of brand value very quickly. And I was in a meeting with him and his top lieutenants, all of whom outranked me. And he said, "Gilson, do this." And I said, "No." Here's why. I said, "No, I'm not going to do that. And here's what's going to happen if I do that." Right. And I left it at that. And the next day, one of his lieutenants said, "You're quite the talk of the town." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Well, nobody tells him those things." And I said, "Somebody needs to tell him those things or we're all going down." And so saying no to your boss when it is in the non-interest of the collective is a good thing to do. You need to explain yourself. And the day after that, he got on a call with me and he said, "I'm going to promote you. Thank you for doing that."
Yep.
And so respect is not given. And think about the opposite. Does anyone give respect to their yes people? If somebody tells you yes every time you open your mouth, do you value their opinion? I'm going to go with hard no. They might make you feel good in the moment, but you will stomp all over those people eventually on your way to whatever you need to be. This is how despots are made, is when people are never told no and they don't respect their inferiors. So yeah, I love the question. And that fear that they're going to fire you. Here's another thing for an agent, somebody who's pursuing optimal agency: let them. If they're going to fire you for adhering to the truth or the priorities of getting things done, great, get another job. And I realize how fearful that can be. Well, how do I take care of my kids? How do I pay the mortgage? What about the car payment? Right? It very much helps to be in a position with wealth and follow our wealth rules where those are not the consequences of you losing your job, aren't that I can't pay my bills anymore. And so you can start to see how those things line up.
Absolutely. Okay. So as I alluded to, we do have 5 tactics that I want to run down to follow this rule on a daily basis. So let's start with the tactic number 1. Don't respond to FYIs and CCs.
There is a culture in any organization where if I've told everybody, I've covered my own ass. And so you'll recognize these emails. These emails do not ask for a specific response from you. They ask for a general response from anyone. So that's what an FYI looks like, right? Hey guys, the file cabinet in the break room's on fire.
Just heads
Great.
up.
Heads up. Heads up. Don't respond to that. Don't respond to that. Someone will put that fire out. It doesn't have to be you. CC is that same thing, right? Essentially, they're not addressing the message to you, but they want to make sure you know. Well, they've done that through the action of CCing. Therefore, your response and engagement is not required. Here's the rule. If you are addressed in the to line and you are addressed in the body of the email by name, you have a responsibility to respond. If you are not, you do not. And I would say that the corollary to that is that you should ask by name for what you want, from whom you want it from. Holy sentence, Batman. When you assemble an email. In other words, if I say, Joe and Sarah, I'm looking to circle back on our Q4 goals. Joe, I need you to clarify what you meant by growing the Peterson account. Please respond to this email. Sarah, I would appreciate it very much if you would take the goals that you've given me on Post-it notes, write them down in a Google Doc, and reshare them to this group in this email thread. And that level of specificity and address tells exactly who is responsible for what, which stops this whole kind of FYI CC nonsense. So yeah, don't respond to those.
Tactic number 2, allow the deliverable to be your response.
So there are cases in which someone will send you an email and say, how is the X coming along? Don't respond to how it's coming along. Send them it. Right? If you can. When somebody says, I'm available at Thursday at 1 or Friday at noon for us to have this discussion, send them the calendar invite for the one of those 2 times that works for you. Don't reply to the email. In other words, all I'm doing is reducing overhead for everybody. I'm not going to have a conversation about a thing that can be answered by a self-evident action. And so that deliverable becomes your answer. You'd be surprised if you look for that, how often you can do that and end communication chains where they sit.
Number 3, gap your replies to non-urgent communications.
So this adds overhead to communication for you. So this is a rare case in which I'm going to advocate that you take on more, not less. When you are emailing about something that's non-urgent, when you are instant messaging about something that's not urgent, I want you to use the schedule send function. Okay? Almost every piece of communication software has this, where you can schedule something to go out at a later date. In other words, if I wanted to respond slowly and carefully to make sure that I had created the right tone and I'd created progress, and I write an email to do that, and then I schedule that send to go out, and this is critical, during business hours the next time through, I have built in a couple of things. One, I've built in an additional buffer if I think about that more, is that the wrong response? So I've got a little bit more buffer there. But probably the more important thing is I'm signaling to colleagues that they will never, ever receive a response to me outside of our agreed upon working hours. And I can't tell you how powerful this is as an executive for getting the people that work for you to love you. Don't send them before and after hours communications. They'll understand that therefore they don't send before and after hours communications. And all of a sudden, the other 16 hours of your life that aren't spent on a weekday at work are yours. And so I love schedule send. I'll use it even if it doesn't, even if it's unnecessary, and not so much to create the gap, because I'm very attuned to responding slowly and carefully with progress, but because of what it does psychologically for everybody else. It enforces essentially an implicit boundary.
Does it also send the signal that you can email me whatever you want, do not expect a response immediately? Right? Because when you create those gaps, what you are doing is you're teaching them that, oh, Patrick is not on his email. And so if I really need an answer right away, I need to find a different way to do it, or I need to do I actually need an answer right away?
Yeah. And what you're hinting at is what I like to refer to as ways of working, or a hierarchy of communication. And in the organizations, and I will acknowledge that I'm now at the point where I set up ways of working for organizations. I am not beholden to legacy ways of working and hierarchies of communication. But typically we'll set that up explicitly. We'll say, if you have something that does not need an immediate response, please send it via email. If you have something that needs a response within 24 hours, please post it to our Trello board using @ and the person that you need a response from. Please turn on the icons of notification on the Trello board when you're on the Trello board, and make a practice of checking that every morning. If something is truly urgent and needs a response right now, and it does not fit either of those filters, please text the person that you need to talk to and tell them that you would like to get time within the next workday to chat live. And so when you set those things up, you run, instead of having to imply that Patrick isn't on his email, we know Patrick isn't on his email if I need something urgently. I've actually set up those ways of working. I'm guessing most of the people in our audience won't have that kind of power to create their ways of working. And so the implication is exactly right. If you can't do that explicitly, how can you show people that those boundaries exist in what they are? And of course, using schedule send is a strong way to do that.
Got it. Okay. Those 3 tactics. 4th tactic, don't engage in poor message hygiene.
I don't think anything indicates that a message is less important than a poorly formed partial sentence sent with no subject, with no salutation, and no closing. Right? And we've kind of joked about messages like this, but sup, you going to be a happy hour ? Right? Is not something that you need to engage with in the same format it came to you. If you do, you are giving your explicit permission to be communicated with in that fashion. And I think that this has become really ubiquitous in our instant messaging culture. We've started to treat email like instant messages.
Yeah.
And started to say, I'm going to put partial thoughts here. I'm not going to think this through. I'm just going to hit the send button. Right? What you do to countermand that's really simple. You send me, sup man, how's it going? I don't reply. You send, hey, can I get an update on the Peterson account? I reply with, dear Patrick, the Peterson account is going well. Here are 5 data points that point to that going well. Data point, data point, data point, data point, data point. Thanks so much for the question. I look forward to your next email. Best, John. Right? In other words, you need to treat poor message hygiene as something to be slapped around with formality. And I realize that you're going to say, well, that doesn't meet the culture of my workplace. Well, guess who's defining the culture of your workplace now? And so I try to say, not only will I not put the vapid in a message, but I will not assign informality to a channel that demands formality. And I believe email is one of those channels, right? And so use a formal structure in your email communications and use complete sentences. I almost feel silly saying those things, but I believe that
it's important. I'm still shocked at how often I get an email that feels like it was written by a 12-year-old.
Right. And I think it's worth saying, if you engage in strong message hygiene, what signals does it send about you? Competence, conscientiousness, the things that are rewarded, right? And it says you took some time with this, and so I must as well. So you're not only signaling your competence, you're training other people. And doing so may sound a little schoolmarmish, but let's imagine that it doesn't matter how it sounds. I will tell you it works.
Last tactic we've got is change the avenue of communications to the correct one.
We have so much messaging technology available to us that we fail to bucket it properly. You have asynchronous communication. What does that mean? It means that I send you a message, but I do not expect a response immediately. Synchronous communication is the opposite. In other words, if you and I were talking face to face and I said, "Hey, Patrick, how's your day?" and you didn't respond for 20 minutes, I would probably call the hospital and or wonder why you didn't like me anymore, right? And so we often try and treat especially asynchronous communication methods as synchronous. That comes when you expect an immediate reply to an email. You're saying this is a synchronous conversation. Well, no, that's not the appropriate venue for a synchronous conversation. How do you have a synchronous conversation? Face to face, phone, video conference, in person. Those are how you have synchronous conversations. How do you have asynchronous? Messaging platform, text, email. And often when someone is misusing one of those, we have to drive them to the other. So let's start with somebody using synchronous communication to do something better handled asynchronously. You've probably had this experience. You're in a staff meeting or you're in a meeting with multiple people, and two of them, despite the fact that there's 10 of you on the call, two of them go into a sidebar where they're discussing a detail about a detail that pertains to their job, but no one else's. That is not an appropriate use of synchronous time. And typically what I'd say to people in that is, that's great. I'm glad we're resolving that. Please take it offline. Right? Please take it somewhere else, basically. And you can have the opposite. And this is probably more prevalent where people are having an asynchronous conversation that drags on. So despite your best efforts to create progress, to have the right tone, to control the cadence, the messages about this thing just keep on coming. And so there's usually an indication there that you would be better served by synchronous conversation. In other words, somebody's being misunderstood or the full context is not being explored in this asynchronous fashion. And so, hey, let's have a meeting. Same thing. If you get to the bottom of an instant messaging thread and there's 27 messages in it about the same thing, stop. You're wasting your time and not creating progress. Move to the correct venue. And I think one of the things we can do with our teams and our staffs and our people and frankly, everybody is educate them on the difference between how do you use asynchronous and synchronous communication. And we hinted at it earlier, Pat, when I said this is the hierarchy of communication in organizations I set up. I'm doing that to say this is when to use synchronous, this is when to use asynchronous. This is the difference between the two. Learn it. Because what it does is it creates serenity and calm for everybody. I'm very aware of the expectations attached to this message.
I'll add one thing to that. Sometimes changing the venue for the correct one, sometimes it's because of the emotional tenor of the communications being done. We talked about this a little bit at the top. Like if something is emotionally aggravating you, if something is triggering you, it's really easy to spit a response back via text. But I bet if you were to have that individual on the phone or face-to-face or even video chat, and they said basically the same thing, and you got you understood the intention, you got the inflection, you saw their face, you might not have been triggered by that. And even if you still were, you're in a place where you can actually use the full gamut of our communication tools, right? Body language, intonation, all these things. And you would skip over the 15 messages where the emotion just continues to get spiked because you're not getting the full message, or you're responding in a way that is then triggering or emotional to that other person. And then you're playing this emotional game of ping pong. And so sometimes if you if we feel ourselves being triggered by a message, whatever that message might be, it might be that like, oh, if I just talk to John instead of just read this email and assume 15 things about what that email is actually about, you might skip to the end of a very long message chain and fix it in 5 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. The thought that pops into my mind as you describe that. And first of all, I couldn't agree with you more. Second, keyboard warrior. We're all wicked tough, brah, when I don't have to look you in the eye. When I don't have to acknowledge you as a person, when I can only acknowledge you as a message, it's easy to fight with you. And as soon as you're actually standing there with me, it's fairly difficult, right? I think everyone who calls someone else on Twitter, X, something, let's call it heinous, like a Nazi, that sort of thing, should immediately have to meet in person with that person and say it again.
Yes.
Would you? And, of course, the argument is, of course not. Of course not. Yes. And I realize I've taken that to an extreme, but I think it illustrates the point, and I love the point.
Let's begin to wrap this chat up about rule number 6 of time. I would love to talk a little bit about what is the end state result when you can start to put these practices, this rule into place. And then maybe more specifically, what is the result as it relates to our time freedom? Because again, this was one of our rules of time. And so when we start to practice this rule, when we start to put this rule into our daily habits, our daily communication habits, what do we get?
Fewer messages, fewer meetings, right? Because I've chosen the right venue, or I've created progress instead of essentially the impetus for more messaging. Obviously, when I have fewer messages incoming and I have fewer meetings, I have fewer obligations, which means that I have more time to do, right? And this is where the theater of life becomes the action of life. I think it's really worth understanding that your progress in your personal relationships, your friendships, your work, your own health comes when you do, not when you talk about doing. Meetings are almost always talking about doing, not doing. Messages are almost always talking about doing, not doing. And so when we respond slowly and carefully and we truncate both messages and meetings, what we do is we create space for doing, which makes you a more effective person, which has the knock-on effect of boosting your personal psychology to say, I am an effective person, which makes you an effective person, which gives you the ability to have the impact that you want to have on the world.
Love that. All right, we're going to wrap it up there. If you would like to read that rule, read all of the rules, you can find them on optimalagency.co. Speaking of, if you have not yet taken the HWT questionnaire, we invite you to. The HWT questionnaire is 60 questions across health, wealth, and time, the categories of agency that we talk about here all of the time. And it is designed to give you an honest assessment of where you currently stand across all three. And importantly, it will also give you some specific directed advice and resources for how to improve wherever you might be the weakest. You can take your HWT questionnaire at optimalagency.co/HWT. The link is in the show notes. We thank you in advance for checking it out. All right. We're going to wrap this episode up with a recommendation. I've got a book recommendation for folks who, if they want to dive a little bit deeper on this particular subject, you may be interested in. The book sitting here right next to me. It's called Smart Brevity. It's by Jim Vanderhei, Mike Allen, and Roy Schwartz. They are the co-founders of a company called Axios, which is a news company that sends newsletters, which seems a little strange to be the recommendation, but the way that they send newsletters is through this process, through this exercise called Smart Brevity. The context that they exist in and why I thought about it in relation to this conversation is we often read and engage with messages that we receive as busy people because we are all too busy. But we rarely communicate in a way that respects the busyness of the people that we are communicating with. And so Smart Brevity is, whether it's done in a newsletter or elsewhere, it's a framework to think about how can I communicate quickly but efficiently. And so the book, again, is called Smart Brevity. We'll just walk you through the process that they use to communicate via their newsletters, which you can then take out and really put into any kind of communications that you are engaging with, emails, Slack stuff, whatever. And so to me, the most important part of the thinking about this is to recognize that a lot of times when we are getting all of those messages and we're pinging things back and we're playing that sort of game of football, if we take the agency to say, let me make sure that I'm communicating as well, as clearly and efficiently as possible, such that I get fewer questions back, such that I get fewer miscommunications back. If I put the effort in first, to the rule's point of responding carefully, if I do a good job of that, I will receive less because I've done the job the first time.
Yeah, I love that. One of the things that, well, first of all, looking forward to reading that book. Check it out. It throws me back.
Unsurprisingly, it's a good and easy read.
Yeah, it should be brief, right? Like it would be ironic if that was a 300-page book. Smart Brevity is what I was taught in graduate school. We had a very, very crusty writing professor, as emeritus as they come. And this is how I know he was as emeritus as the professors come. He died during the semester I took his class.
There you go.
And of old age. But he was absolutely a full-on advocate, and that's just putting the nicest possible shine on it, of don't use words that don't matter. Don't use words that don't matter. You would write a letter, and his red crayon would rip it apart in terms of, and he rarely changed the substance of what you were saying, but he took out adverbs. He took out superlatives. He took out half of the sentence, right? Don't say, we've come to a point where our human resources costs exceed our ability to form productive economic output. He said, right, you're all fired. Right. And so I think what I take away from things like Smart Brevity and respond slowly and carefully is also avoid the need to editorialize. Provide facts, and obviously, having not read the book, I can't comment on it, but I can comment on that 2006 experience at Harvard.
I think you're moving in the right direction already. So cool. All right, my friend. Thank you for that. Thank you, everybody out there, for listening. Thank you for your ratings and your reviews. Thank you, especially when you share the show with friends or colleagues or other folks in your lives who might need a little bit more agency in their lives. John and I will be back next week for another episode of the Optimal Agency Podcast.